Welcome to the F9 Mercury P5 walkthrough, our tribute to the iconic sound of a legendary analog synthesizer. We have meticulously crafted 144 multi-sample patches that capture the essence and spirit of this remarkable synth. These patches are available as Ableton racks with a complete set of macros and effects, as well as Logic patches that load seamlessly from the Logic library with a full plugin chain. We're excited to announce Bitwig support in this release. All patches come as Bitwig devices with remote controls and an internal effects chain. Additionally, we're extremely proud to present our new Kontakt full-featured GUI with SSL-style EQ on every patch. Please note that this requires a full version of Kontakt, not the free Kontakt player. All three DAW versions come with 5 demo projects that not only show you exactly what this pack can do, but deliver 5 sets of modern synthwave drum stems that we've also edited into kits with round-robin snares. You can tear these projects down in the comfort of your own DAW and see how we've layered, processed, mixed and arranged these sounds and the audio demos. The majority of these patches were sampled round robin. This is a process that takes more than one sample per key span and then either rotates through them or uses a random sample from that pool. This brings back the movement, life and emotive flow of this classic analog synth. As we are using internal DAW plugins, this release is fully compatible with Apple Silicon and the latest Mac OS versions, as well as the latest versions of Windows and Linux for Bitwig users. So an awful lot going on there. Let's start to unpack it because these demos show you exactly what these sounds are capable and ways you can layer them all together. Let's start at the bass in this first section. So basically the basses in this particular project do change. We've got the fast-paced bass of the chorus here. Whilst at the beginning we've got this section of bass that is playing long sustained notes. Now that's made up of 3 patches. This patch is called Legend. Now it has been heavily filtered out. I'm just going to pull up the smart controls here and we'll pull the low cut all the way back down so you can hear it in its natural state. So it's one of those great big growling, really slow filter sweeps that the P5 is just so perfect at. This is being layered up with a quite a tight sounding bass patch, but with a nice long sustain to it. And a sub bass right at the bottom. Let me just put that high pass filter back on the first patch and then play you all 3 together again. You see how beautifully they work together. 3 very different sounds, and that, as we've shown in the recent layering video, is the absolute golden rule when you're trying to layer different sounds together. Make sure every single one has its own personality and there are contrasts between. Now, to trigger these 3 bass patches, you see that I've got replicated MIDI parts. But whilst I was playing through, I did just highlight this. What I've actually created here is a track stack inside of Logic and placed the MIDI file on the top of that stack. Now that will actually then send the MIDI to anything that is an instrument channel underneath it. And this is really important to understand with Logic. A lot of people don't realize this. You can obviously copy it into place inside of the stack, but actually you may as well just have one MIDI part. That means you've only got one piece of MIDI to edit. So it's just a way for us to show different methods of working within Logic. Now, just while I'm here, I want to play you the drums in solo. As you can hear, the drums have an absolute ton of punch. Really pleased with the way that they've come through. And we have converted all of these into drum kits. But one little trick I wanted to show you is that I set up an auxiliary send here. This is on bus 3, and I just put Logic's overdrive onto it. I've just dug in by about 5 dB there. I've opened the filter of the plugin all the way up, but I have dropped the level. So this allows me to keep that auxiliary floating around 0. The most useful part of any fader is around 0 dB. You don't want faders all the way down here. Having it up there can really, really help. But let me just show you on the loudest bit here, the difference before and after. So I'm going to start with that overdrive muted and then put it in halfway. Hear that little bit of extra weight? This plugin, the overdrive in Logic, is one of my top tips. You've really got to get your head around this because it adds an awful lot of really good harmonic information. Ever so useful, even to use on an auxiliary like this, effectively having it in parallel. Now, obviously, we converted the drums into drum kits, and to load them is the same as any patch inside this library. Create a new instrument channel in Logic, make sure you're on User Patches, head to the Mercury P5 patches, and then into drum kits. Now, you notice we've got 2 versions. That is because the Drum Machine Designer changed in Logic Pro 10.5. Now, I'm in 10.5 here, so I can use the new system that has Quick Sampler and all of the rest of it, so I'm going to load those kits. And here is the new drum kit, and like all of the modern drum kit designers, you get all of the individual channels that you can process separately within the mixer should you wish to, and you can also use the brand new step programming features that are available inside of Logic with these 10.5 kits. Now, if you don't have Logic 10.5, don't worry, the kits are still available as patches that will load with either the EXS24 if you're on a version before 10.5 or the new Logic sampler. So we've got both formats available there. But that's not the only way to load any of these patches. We've hijacked the Apple Loop system. So if I come down to our collection here, I can go F9 Mercury P5 Apple Loops, and you'll see that these are all green Apple Loops. Now that means they have an audio file but data connected to it. So for example, let's have a listen to this. If I grab that and drag that onto the page, not only will the MIDI come across instead of the audio, but the entire sample chain as well with smart controls, the whole shebang. And it is a great way to pick these patches up, and it even works for the drum kits. There, that's the whole kit loaded and the demo sequence. Now this is great for just deciding what kind of sound that you might be wanting to pull from the library and having an audio demo. Let me just play another little section back from this project. That for me is a perfect example of the contrast that we have in this patch collection. There's an awful lot of different types of sounds, including the kind of sequency sounds that we all know and love that are heavily filtered on this track, but we can automate using the smart controls. Oh, I almost forgot there is an patch with a whole collection of different modulation-based effects. Now, the Prophet 5 has a very famous modulation section known as the polymod section, and it allows you to cross-modulate oscillators together and all sorts, bring that modulation into the filters, that kind of thing, and it's great for sound effects. So there's an entire menu on one of the patches with a different sound effect on each key. So excellent for use as effects there. But I'm making great use here of some of the more textural sounds that can be found in the synths folder. Hear those amazing overtones? The Prophet 5 is absolutely famous for that. I'm just picking that out with a pluck sound as well. So this gives you a great idea of some of the textural noise that you can get out of this kind of synth. Now, those are joined in the verse section by this 2-note pad part that's from this patch called Sunlight. And this patch responds to modulation wheel. If you push the modulation wheel forward, it will actually close the filter down, and it means you can bring it back with some filter sweeps like this. Now, if I were to open this right up, you'll hear the real power of this patch. A classic Prophet 5 string patch. And this is the beauty of presenting sounds like this with MIDI, is that we can show you different techniques and musical ideas for playing these kind of sounds. Like, for example, you see that keyboard little run that I've put into certain sections of this. That was played in live with the quantize turned off, but everything else was then quantized tightly around it. And you get this live rumble into it as you're pushing up through a keyboard there. So as I say, these are all to dissect at your leisure. These MIDI parts are obviously available in every single one of the DAW editions, but also as a separate folder in all of the formats. Obviously, we're in classic polysynth mode here. Now, that era was famous for brass sounds, and we've got some absolute corkers here, each with their own personality. Now, this is actually how this library started. Someone asked me for 80s brass sounds. And of course, the Prophet 5 is absolutely legendary for this. Off I went. And then I suddenly realized, actually, this synth can handle entire tracks, and it's time to really show that. Now, let's just head to the A section here for a minute, because I want to show you the versatility of some of these sounds. So we got one patch here called Body Brass that is one of the forefronts of the actual riff. But another instance of it is actually providing some chordal information down the bottom. And for me, the ability to take patches and use them in two different ways is the sign of a great sound. But that's also credit to our round-robin sampling techniques that we've used extensively throughout this release. Now, I've just completed another tip video on layering synths, where I really talk an awful lot about using contrast, and this on this lead line is a perfect example. So here's another lead that I've actually layered against the brass patch. It's got some pitch wobble to it, some really nice sort of, I don't know if it's vibrato or it's just almost a little bit lo-fi, but that against this brass sound, they're really working well together. Now you'll also notice that I've just lightly panned them, giving them their own little tiny bit of space. It may be subtle, but it's really working and adds to the stereo feel of the actual composite sound. Such a simple trick, but it just works an absolute treat. Now, in Logic, you can go further than that with the pans. You can right-click on any of the pan, turn it into a stereo pan control, which has width as well as direction. Ever such a good tip for placing sounds like this. Now, I'm always trying to throw arrangement ideas at you guys with these projects as well, and that I certainly have done here. So the first chorus starts with the main riff. And then there is a post-chorus section where two more lead sounds that are layered here, Howard lead and sharp lead, come in. And they work around a slightly different bass part. So in other words, you've got this kind of post-chorus, almost rocky feel to it. Now that gives a nice bit of energy and it sounds like it wants to go back into our main verse section. So in other words, you're always trying to fall back into that resolution. Now on the second chorus, I actually changed things around and put that splat poly sound in. And then added the riff to what was the post-chorus section of the part before. Now, it wasn't a happy accident. I wanted to do it, but I thought I was going to have to change the notes of the riff. But once I got used to it, I was like, no, it works perfectly. Now onto the middle section, which in the UK we know as the middle eight, but in America and probably the rest of the world, it's known as the bridge. So we've gone half time there with the drums. You hear that DMX clap really kicks through at that point. And also it adds a great counterpoint to the energy that's come before and allows us to fall into this little hole. So we're off into another section again and the full-time drums are back. So again, another fantastic little arrangement idea there for you. Arrangement, again, it's very similar to synth laying. It's all about contrast. If you can create contrast within your arrangement, either by changing the sounds, the style, the feel, you will instantly make a more engaging production. Now, just before we go into the other DAWs, let's have a good look at the Kontakt edition here. And we've got a new full-featured GUI. It brings an awful lot of control under a simple interface, and I'm really pleased to have the SSL style EQ that's built into Kontakt available on the GUI here at the bottom. But let me just show you this piece. I've kidnapped one of the beats from our Neptune collection for the MPC and just created this nice and mellow piece of music. This will show you some of the softer sides of this library. So let's first of all have a look at this bass sound and see if we can get a bit more action on it. I've just muted everything else and I'm going to have a little play with the EQ as it rolls around. Now on this EQ, on either of the shelving parts here where it says frequency, you can click on it and it will change from a shelf to a bell EQ. All of this is explained in the manual, so do make sure that you're picking up all the tricks and tips. Now we have a glide control here and you can hear some of the glide in action just on this section. And right underneath it in the performance area, we've got a pitch bend control. So if I play a note and bend down, it'll go down an entire tone or 2 semitones. But you can change that all the way to 12. Internally, there's a dedicated LFO for vibrato. And the vibrato is actually normally in most patches sent to the pitch of the patch via the mod wheel. And this control here will affect how much. So if I turn the mod wheel all the way up and bring that down, but if I turn the mod wheel off, it's not making an effect. So a nice little bit of control there. Now I'm actually going to use the overdrive control just a little bit more on this bass. Now later on we're adding this patch which is called Jan's bass. We don't need much bass on that, so let's pull the bass down and I'm just going to grind into the lower mids. Each patch will have a width control here, and I'm going to push it quite wide here, but bearing in mind the Prophet 5 is a mono source, and we've used all sorts of chorus pedals, outboard choruses and things like that to add some width to some of these patches. So you're really going to be pushing that information out, but still keeping a nice solid core. That's mono. Hear the difference there. I'm also going to bring down the amount that the filter envelope affects the filter and turn off the velocity response completely. Maybe add a little bit of ambience to this bass using this reverb control here. Let's see what that sounds like in the track. Interesting, but I can still hear the bass modulating against each other quite a lot. So I'm going to solo and use our high pass filter on the GUI. And I'm just going to pan it slightly one side, actually, this extra bass. The round robin handling inside of Kontakt is excellent. It's note by note, and sometimes that can mean different round robins when you're actually using duplicates of the same patch. Let's see if that happens here. Spot on. Yeah, perfect. Let's just balance this a bit. It's all a bit loud. I'm just going to pull them a bit further apart and just drop them both down a bit. Now, the beginning of this track is using this little motif from a pad sound called Bookend Pad. And as you can see here, I'm using two. I've got exactly the same patch on both, but if I pull up the other one, I've made a very small change. Now, we've hidden a couple of tweakers on the GUI. The first tweaker is up here and it controls the output of the whole patch. The other one is down here that is just by this line. You see, it's really faint here, but this will control the fine tuning of the patch. Now, if you were to look at these tiny tweakers here, you'll see that they're in slightly different positions, and then I've panned both of these instances left and right. Mixing that with the round robin handling, you can get this fantastically wide sound. Now let's make it even wider, but I'm going to use some quite serious EQ. On the first instance here, I'm going to turn this EQ into a bell EQ, turn the gain right up and just sweep around until I find a nice spot. But now I'm going to go for about there. And then on this second instance, which is on the right, I'm going to do the same. Different EQ points. Let's see what they sound like in stereo. Okay, I am going to want to scoop both of these out the way of the bass, so I'm going to use the high pass filter that's on the GUI. Here's the left-hand one. Not quite so much resonance. The resonance will leave a nice peak just around the place that we're cutting off. So sometimes having slightly different high pass filter values between these two will work as well. Just a bit of a rebalance there between these levels to compensate for that EQ change. Let's have a listen. Once again, we're trying to create contrast between the layered patches. Now, I've added a nice low pluck sound to that little motif. Here it is. I've got two of them again using a similar technique. So let's just EQ that up in a similar way. In fact, let's play with the filter a bit, bring the general cutoff down. Oh, that's nice. Now we've got a compressor, which is a feedback style compressor. If you know the effects that are built into Kontakt, you've probably seen that. And you'll see it's a very simple control set. It's just input into the compressor, the attack time, which can basically sort of control the punch of the sound, and then a mix. So I'm going to bring the mix all the way down and fire quite hard into the compressor. Then I'm going to bring our volume tweaker down here right next to this little amp. You see it's tiny little control, but ever so useful. So I've got an identical patch pan slightly to the right. We're now in solo. What I've done here is I've changed the vibrato rate. It's a little too fast there. And having these micro changes between the patches will allow them to stack beautifully. Oh, and I forgot, I actually played this line in without quantize, and I played it in separately for each bit. So the same part, I'm playing the same thing, unquantized, and that's how you get that lovely spread in stereo. Okay, let's listen to that in the track now. So to add some brass to this, I've actually used two different patches. I've used Blake's Poly here and Garden Brass, pan them far left, far right, put both of them on Omni mode, both of the Kontakt instances, sorry, on Omni mode, so it's playing back beautifully. Let me solo one. And the other. And you hear that one on the right has a higher octave in the sound and slightly more built-in modulation. So when you layer them together, you've got two slightly different sounds. As that contrast again, you get a thicker output. Let's just roll off some of the bottom here. In fact, we'll take some off with the EQ as well. So we're out the way of that bass and add in. And now we've got a big old pluck joining in called Quake Time Pluck. Now there's a built-in convolution reverb here that I'm going to use a lot of on this sound and quite a bit of delay too. So they're very basic controls on this GUI, but they do exactly what they say on the tin. So there we go. We've lifted all of those sounds up just using the GUI. So as you can see, you can do an awful lot before you have to apply a single other plugin to this using the controls of that GUI. So now let's cover the Ableton release, and this is one of our first big Ableton packs. It will install as per the instructions in the manual in the packs section of your library, and that means one thing. Yes, we have audio previews on all of the patches. This is something that you guys have been asking for forever, particularly push users, so we're really pleased to be able to use this system from now on. Just do be aware that if you want to fully archive any of the projects using this pack, make sure you click this box, Files from Factory Packs, when you do a collect all and save. And as always, all you got to do is pick it up and drag it onto a blank instrument channel, and that will load the rack. We've got a collection of rack controls, and these will change depending on the actual patch. They're very straightforward. Attack and release will just deal with the basic envelope. We've got the spread control, which is one of the parameters that's built inside the sampler that will basically create a copy of the patch and push them left and right. Ever so handy with an Ableton. A drive control that will just add some subtle overdrive to the patch. High pass filter, low pass filter, and a delay, a stereo delay. I think it's almost like a ping pong, and a nice reverb on every rack. We actually encode all of the racks with the simplest filter, which is known as the clean circuit. There are 4 analog modeled filters here, and the reason we don't use them as default on the racks is that they can be quite CPU intensive. And you may have a nice big powerful desktop machine that you're running Ableton on, but we also need to cater for people that are running on their brother's laptop or something like that. We want to be as inclusive as possible. So you can easily just switch filter models out here. And also, don't forget, if you are an Ableton Suite user with any of the patches, you can right click at the top of the patch name here and change it from a simpler to a sampler and get all of the extended editing functions and additional MIDI controls. One thing I would suggest you all have a play with if you do have Suite is this FM oscillator. Some incredible tones can be gotten out of this system just with a little bit of experimentation. Now, do feel free to actually see how we've set these racks up and how we've actually routed everything. One thing we did add, which we just thought was useful, is a really simple macro EQ. It's just actually a collection of macros that are hitting fixed frequency points on an EQ8, but it's ever so quick to open up and dial in a sound. I really like to gain stage my productions and keep the faders or the actual channel levels as close to 0 as possible. And that's easy to do just by clicking open this icon here. Then you've got the entire rack level that you can use to regain anything that you want. The drum kits are in this folder and have preview files as well. And every single drum rack there also has a corresponding sequence. So if you want that demo sequence, you can just pick it up and drag it onto your arrange page, and lo and behold, like all Ableton clips, and it will drop on the drum kit. Now, in nearly all the drum kits, there's 1 or 2 round robin sounds. Now, that may seem silly for drums because they're obviously from a digital source, but all decent reverbs have modulation in their tail, which means there's a degree of randomness. And for us, this was the best way to kind of capture the life from the main drum stems that we made. For me, this project is fascinating, and I'm using a nice little musical trick. So basically, we've got quite a simple A and B section. We've got this first section that goes between G, little bass rise up here, and then back down into the D. So it's effectively just two chords. Then on the second section, effectively the B section, we've got a slightly different chord sequence. So it's rising up to the B flat or the A sharp, the third note in the minor scale of G minor, then falling back down to the A, just flipping briefly down to F before it's pulling back up to G. Over this G, we're not playing G minor, which is the actual tonic or root chord of the actual piece. We're playing a G major. And we're doing this both times on this little round. Let me show you what I mean. And this shift between the major chord at the end of one section and the same chord but minor version at the beginning of the next brings this real tension and release. And you wouldn't think that that's basically running around the same note. Both of those chords are rooted in G, but they feel completely different. And it gives a brilliant counterpoint for our solo parts at that point. So that's basically me just falling down the G major chord there. So you're almost borrowing that G major chord from the major scale and then flipping instantly back to the minor because the first chord on the next section is actually based on the minor scale. Now, for this first round of melody, I've actually taken two completely different sounds. I've used a lead sound and a pluck sound. The lead sound is called entropy, and yes, I pulled the release time really long on this, so all I've got to play is single notes. The sound above it is actually a pluck sound called trillion. And together they do this. And you hear I'm playing slightly different notes on the trillion part, but then you hear them in the track. So once again, we got that contrast between the two different patches, really reinforcing the melodies. I've got this high resonance patch just picking out a few tones. When I designed this patch before sampling it, I made sure that the keyboard was affecting the filter cutoff 100% with high resonance, so you get these amazing overtones when you play it across multiple octaves. I'm using a brass patch that I've edited here just to bring out certain notes of the chords. And that's paired against a patch called Miami Bass. That's also got two patches layered together that have a big resonance sweep on them. And of course our drums. So let me just solo all of that together and you'll hear the main rhythm section. Got a lovely soft pad in the background here called Blind Pad. And you'll hear a sidechain on there. What I've done is grabbed all of them together and I've actually routed them into an audio track. Now, why would you do this instead of grouping inside of Ableton? Well, that's because grouping tracks together like this will actually create a similar internal structure inside of Ableton to an effects return track. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm correct in saying that Ableton processes every single track like this on just one core of the processor. So sometimes it's a little bit more efficient to actually drop them all onto a track. And then the great great thing is if you're ever wanting to archive or create stems, all you got to do is hit record on that track and actually record the parts in. And of course, to see how that's done, all you got to do is click this input and output icon on the far right of Ableton here. And as you can see, you just grab anything that you want to, and then you can send it to a track. All you have to do then is put that track into input mode. Now, also what you want to do is just make sure the track that you're targeting is set to no input, just in case you're on a laptop and the microphone suddenly becomes the default input, and then this can bring all sorts of kind of howling noises and all the rest of it. Not what you want. I'm using a few effects and textural patches here from the pack. This is the Formula 1 patch. Excellent for rising into new sections, and one of my favorites here called Spluttering. Listen to this. Hear the polymod and some pitch bend working really well together. Let me just play that in context. And for me, that was always the beauty of the Prophet 5. In high resonance, it just kind of sang far more than a lot of modern synths. It's that vintage voice architecture that is just so easy to place into tracks. I've always said there are certain synths that are just voiced beautifully for music production. Now, obviously, everybody loves some arrangement tips. And one thing that I've done here to keep the interest up between basically a repeat of each section is use different sounds and slightly tweaked melodies. So here I used another lead sound called Resin. And you hear that beautiful modulation that's just a calling card of the Prophet 5. Then later on in the second section, as you heard there, I use an arpeggiated sound, but instead of being a lead, it's actually a bass. It's always a good idea with any patch collection to see if you can repurpose any of the sounds in a different octave, because sometimes they really have some spice. And as we're getting bigger here, I've opened up the Sunlight pad to make it into a polysynth and marking out the chords with long sustain notes. Here's the rack, and you can see I've edited the amp release so it's nice and long. And that's being also helped along by two slightly fatter brass patches. Same trick as I've used on all of this. As you can see here, I've panned each one slightly left and right. And a little drop down in the arrangement here before we hit back off to the end, firing in an awful lot of the leads that we've heard before and some more. See if you can pick out that G major chord. And what's exciting for us with this template format is that you can tear these things down in the comfort of your own DAW space and investigate how we've put everything together, from arrangement, from sound design, from the patches, etc., etc. We really do try to add as much detail as possible. This is perfectly highlighted by these two lead lines at the end. Listen to the harmonization between them. I implore every single one of you who's interested to check out Bitwig. This is the first time we've supported it, and its conversion route for us was an absolute joy. I learned so much about it and kept on getting surprised. Here's a tiny little taster of what I mean here. Let's go to the drum track and solo it. This is the stock EQ inside of Bitwig, and you can see some movement there that's in time with the drums. If I click on the modulation section here, you'll see that I've inserted an audio sidechain. If I click on its modulation destinations, you'll see that there is a little bit on this shallow EQ. Let me just dial in a little bit more. That's built into the EQ. Now, I'm just going to let that settle with you if you've never seen this before. This is a modulator that is available on a stock EQ that is being triggered by the audio sidechain coming into it. And yes, you can take that from any other place you want to within the session. You'll also see exactly the same trick in action on the bass stem here. This is stock plugins. This is unbelievable levels of control. Now, for me, people who start arguing about whether which computer is better or which DAW is better, it's the equivalent of two painters actually sat in a field arguing about their paintbrushes. It's not about what you use, it's about the art that you actually create with it. But sometimes some tools come across that you need to be aware of, and for me, Bitwig is one of them. I have been blown away by this thing, and look, it's a beautiful looking thing as well. All of our patches load as Bitwig devices, and the internal architecture of Bitwig means that all of the samples are contained within, so you cannot separate easily the sample information from the actual patches. If I click on the sample edit here, you can see if I select everything, we've got it in full round robin mode. We've also supplied all of the sounds, all of the 144 patches here, with a full complement of remote controls with the most useful parts on there. If you click the effects button here, you'll see a nice little simple EQ and compressor rack here that we've created, as well as some basic delay and reverbs effects. This is on every single patch. Full instructions are inside of the manual showing you how to install all of these, and you can put them into the presets menu inside of the browser. They then appear at the top, and you can select the sub instrument type that you want here, or just click on the top to see all of them in a list. It's then simply a job of picking one up and dropping it onto a track again. It will load with everything in place. We've got some modulators set up, including vibrato for most of the patches, and also there is an envelope available by clicking here that controls the filter a lot of the time, with some macro controls over its depth, etc., etc. Drum kits are also available, and we've got some overall effects just available in the chains there, and a nice collection of macro controls. We've also included the MIDI files that will trigger these kits perfectly for you. Now, whilst we mention MIDI, we have to explore the MIDI 2.0 or MPE capabilities of Bitwig. And as you can see, you can draw in pitch curves and pitch slides per note. Incredibly powerful. And that is handled perfectly by the sampler instruments. In fact, all of Bitwig's internal instruments obviously work with that. And if you've got any kind of MPE or polyphonic aftertouch enabled keyboard, the combination of these patches and that kind of control can be wonderful. And I have to say, one of my favourite all-time 80s created snares in this pack. Got some bass layering going on here with the blaster bass and the Miami Vice bass. Bitwig, like Ableton, allows for very easy creation of parallel processing racks like this one, where I've got a really heavy-handed compressor. Slamming into that bass line and then adding it to the dry signal. And I've just added one simple remote control here. That's the Bitwig parlance for macros that allows that to be turned up or down. Heading just into the peak limiter that's built into Bitwig there, just to round off those double transients that we're getting by layering those bass sounds together. And then a little bit of sidechain with the dynamics module. Now, I don't know whether it was just because I was new to this and it's always great fun to play with a new toy, but I did find layering patches inside of this very easy and very simple. They seem to fit together really nicely. Here's two that I'm using in a similar style to the way that we've discussed before, coming in later on the track. And then some bigger, washier brass patches. There's two of these. That's the first one called Brassic. This one is called Night Sky. So basically, I've just opened the release right up on both of those patches and let them play together. One is panned slightly left, one is slightly right. Didn't need much on there just to give that little bit of separation and the extra power. And I've got this excellent patch here called Spectra Bass that's using a lot of polymod functionality on the Prophet 5 to give it this real metallic edge, and using it a bit higher up so it's almost like a lead. One thing I really love doing for these retro style productions is taking something like a pluck sound, playing it in the lower octaves and firing it into lots of reverb like this. It brings about a real sense of gravity when you're hitting those root notes. Let me just show you that lead line. It really cuts through, doesn't it? It's called Soaring Lead, and I've used the MIDI 2.0 functionality here. So basically, with this, you don't have to define an actual pitch bend range. You can just decide it on the fly whilst you're actually editing MIDI where you want it to go. And trust me, it can go a long way. Later on in this production, some of the sequencer sounds that we built come into play and add some percussive interest. And here I've just taken a slow LFO into one of the modulation sockets and added it to the left and right pan on the actual sampler. So you can do all of this just within the same box. And against the rest of our synth backdrop, it sounds like this. Actually, I do love this wonderful soft brass patch that's down here. But I must admit, I was really taken with the clarity and depth of the sound of this DAW and the sound of the patches. There's a real presence to the way that the samples are actually being pumped back out of this. Listen to all those analog oscillators coming together when all of the brass and strings are stacked on top of each other at the end. Now, as you can probably hear, I'm really quite taken with Bitwig. It's a remarkable looking and a remarkable sounding piece of technology. Everything has been very well thought out, and throughout the entire conversion process of this pack and everything to do with it, it didn't crash once. Not once. That cannot be said for any of the other platforms that I was working on from this, because I do tend to throw the stuff around really quickly whilst I'm actually in operation. The other thing that I found is I got into flow state with this DAW very quickly indeed. Now, I'm lucky that because of what we do here, I get to have a look around all of this technology, and I do understand very much that everything is a tight financial consideration. But if any of you are looking to either move or start or change DAWs, give this thing a look, because it's got some remarkable features. It's not full featured. For example, it won't load audio units inside of an Apple. That may restrict you in terms of your plugins, but the stuff that you gain is definitely worth having a look. And these modulation functions and being able to just pile them into absolutely any stock plugin is basically second to none. Thank you so much for watching this walkthrough of F9 Mercury P5. Do go and check out all of the audio demos and all of the information on the product page. We've got an awful lot up there. Take care, every single one of you, and we'll see you next time.